There are some places in America where silence feels heavier than noise. The southern border, especially at night, is one of them. This story didn't come from a news report, it didn't trend on social media, and it was never officially recorded as an incident. But among Border Patrol officers who worked the night shifts near the desert, there is a story that still circulates quietly, usually told in low voices, usually followed by an uncomfortable pause. It begins on a winter night, just after midnight, at a small Border Patrol station miles away from the nearest town. The station itself was nothing unusual, a single-story concrete building surrounded by fencing, floodlights, and endless desert. During the day, it looked ordinary, almost boring. But at night, when the wind dragged sand across the ground and the lights buzzed softly, the place felt exposed, too open, too quiet. That night, only a handful of officers were on duty. One of them was a senior patrol officer named Jack Miller. Jack had been working border security for over a decade. He had seen smugglers, desperate families, false alarms, and long empty nights where nothing happened at all. He wasn't the kind of man who scared easily, and he certainly didn't believe in ghost stories. At least, not back then. Jack was seated at the central desk, monitoring radio traffic while sipping lukewarm coffee. The lights in the station hummed above him. A surveillance monitor showed empty stretches of desert, motionless, silent. Everything was normal, until the radio crackled. At first, it was faint, just a burst of static, the kind that happens all the time in remote areas. Jack barely reacted. He reached out, adjusted a dial, and continued staring at the screen. Then the radio crackled again. This time, it didn't stop. A low, uneven sound filled the room. Not quite static, not quite interference either. Jack frowned and leaned closer. He pressed the transmit button. "Border Patrol Station, identify yourself." There was no reply, only breathing. Slow, heavy, uncomfortably close. Jack pulled his hand back slightly. Breathing through the radio wasn't unheard of. Open mics happened, but something about this felt wrong. The breathing wasn't rushed. It wasn't panicked. It was deliberate. Jack tried again. "This channel is restricted. Identify yourself now." The breathing continued. Then, beneath it, there was another sound. A faint clicking noise, irregular and wet, like something pressing against a microphone that shouldn't have been there. Jack glanced toward the hallway leading to the other rooms. His coworkers were present, but none of them were near a radio. He released the transmit button and waited. After a few seconds, the radio went silent. Jack exhaled and shook his head. "Interference," he muttered to himself. He reached for his coffee. Before he could take a sip, the radio beeped again. Incoming transmission. Jack froze. The display didn't show a call sign. No unit number, no external channel. Just an open signal. Jack hesitated for a moment, then pressed the button. "This is Border Patrol. State your emergency." This time, the breathing stopped. For a moment, there was nothing at all. Then a voice came through. Low, uneven, almost mechanical. "You shouldn't be here." Jack straightened in his chair. The voice was speaking English, but the cadence was off. The pauses were wrong. The words sounded practiced, as if they had been learned, not lived. Jack stood up. "Who is this?" he demanded. No response. The radio clicked once, then went dead. Jack stared at it, his heartbeat louder than the room around him. He looked toward the surveillance monitors again. Still nothing. The desert remained empty. He picked up the phone and dialed another officer in the building. "Did you hear that transmission?" Jack asked. There was a pause on the other end. "No," the officer replied. "What transmission?" Jack hung up slowly. That was the first moment something shifted. Not fear, not yet, just unease. Jack logged the incident as minor radio interference and tried to move on. He told himself it was nothing more than atmospheric distortion or a damaged repeater. But the night wasn't finished with him. 10 minutes later, the motion sensors outside the station triggered. Floodlights snapped on, bathing the desert in harsh white light. Jack rushed to the window. There was nothing there. No movement, no heat signatures, no figures. Just sand, fencing, and darkness beyond the light. As Jack turned back toward the desk, the radio turned on by itself. No beep, no alert. It simply came alive. And this time, the voice that spoke was unmistakable. It sounded exactly like Jack Miller. "Border Patrol Station, identify yourself." Jack's stomach dropped. He hadn't touched the radio. He hadn't spoken. Yet his own voice, down to the tone, the pacing, the slight rasp, played back through the speaker. Jack stepped backwards, his eyes fixed on the radio. Then his voice spoke again. "You answered the call." The lights in the station flickered once, and somewhere in the building, something moved.
When the lights flickered back on, Jack Miller was still standing in the same spot, staring at the radio as if it might speak again. For several seconds, nothing happened. The station returned to its usual hum, air vents, electrical buzz, distant wind pushing against the building. Everything looked normal. Too normal. Jack swallowed and forced himself to move. He stepped closer to the desk, eyes never leaving the radio. His reflection stared back at him from the dark computer screen. Pale, tense. He reached out and shut the radio off completely. The silence that followed was worse. It felt thick, as if the air itself was listening. Jack took a deep breath and keyed his mic to contact the perimeter unit. "Unit 4, do you copy?" Static. He tried again. "Unit 4, status check?" Nothing. Jack checked the monitor. Unit 4's vehicle icon was still visible on the map, parked along the outer fence line. According to the system, they were less than a mile away. Jack grabbed his jacket and stepped into the hallway. 2 other officers were in the break room, laughing quietly over something on a phone. They looked up when they saw Jack's expression. "Everything okay?" one of them asked. "Did either of you use the radio just now?" Jack asked. They exchanged looks. "No," the other officer said. "Why?" Jack hesitated. "Did you hear my voice over the radio?" They shook their heads. One of them frowned. "Jack, you all right, man?" Jack forced a nod. "Yeah, probably interference." But even as he said it, he knew that wasn't true. Interference didn't repeat words perfectly. Interference didn't sound exactly like you. Jack returned to the main room alone. He turned the radio back on. Immediately, it stayed quiet. He waited. 30 seconds passed. A minute. Nothing. Jack exhaled, feeling foolish. He sat back down and pulled up the night log, typing a brief note about equipment malfunction. His fingers trembled slightly. That was when the security camera feed changed. One of the external cameras, camera 3, shifted on its own. Jack hadn't touched the controls. The feed zoomed slightly, focusing on a section of fence near the western edge of the station's perimeter. Jack leaned forward. At first, he thought it was a shadow. Then the shadow moved. Not crossing the fence, not approaching the gate, just standing there. The floodlights illuminated the area clearly, yet whatever stood near the fence didn't reflect light properly. It looked thinner than a person, wrongly shaped. Jack's heart began to pound. He grabbed the radio mic. "Unit 4, respond immediately." Static answered him. The shape on the screen tilted its head. Jack's breath caught. The movement was slow, curious, almost thoughtful. Then the radio spoke. Jack. His name. Jack dropped the mic. The voice was quiet this time, closer, as if it weren't coming from the radio at all, but from somewhere inside the room. Jack turned in a slow circle. "Who's there?" he demanded, though his voice cracked. No one answered. The shape on the monitor remained still. Jack backed toward the exit, his hand brushing against the wall for balance. He told himself to leave the room, to get backup, to turn on every light and alarm in the building. Instead, he stopped, because the radio clicked once, then spoke again. "You're not supposed to hear me yet." Jack's stomach twisted. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The radio remained silent for several seconds. Then, "You needed me to answer." The shape on the camera began to move, not toward the fence, toward the station. Jack grabbed his flashlight and ran outside, the desert air hitting him like a slap. The floodlights burned his eyes as he scanned the perimeter. Nothing. The fence was empty. The sand showed no footprints. Behind him, the station door creaked softly. Jack turned. The radio inside was still transmitting. His voice came through the speaker again, distorted slightly now. "You answered the call." Jack rushed back inside and slammed the door shut. "What is this? Who are you?" The radio crackled. Then the voice lowered. "I've been waiting a long time." The temperature in the room dropped. He could feel it. His breath fogged faintly in front of his face. On the desk, the radio display began to flicker. Numbers scrolled rapidly, frequencies changing on their own. Jack backed away. "I didn't call you," he said. The radio paused. Then came the response. "No," the agreement came, "but you listened." The outer hallway lights dimmed. Somewhere deeper in the building, a door opened slowly. Jack realized then that whatever was speaking didn't need the radio anymore. It had learned his voice, and it was getting closer.
By the time Jack realized the voice no longer needed the radio, the station no longer felt like a place of safety. The hallway lights dimmed further, sinking into a low amber glow that barely reached the floor. The air felt heavier now, pressing against his chest with every breath. Somewhere in the building, a door had opened, but not with the sharp sound of hinges. This was slower, careful, intentional. Jack stood frozen near the main desk, flashlight clenched tightly in his hand. He listened. Nothing. No footsteps. No movement. Only the faint hum of electricity and the sound of his own breathing, loud and uneven in his ears. "Stay calm," he whispered to himself. He forced his feet to move. Jack stepped into the hallway, shining the flashlight ahead. The beam stretched across the floor, cutting through shadows that seemed deeper than they should have been. The offices on either side were dark, empty, too empty. He reached the break room. The door was open. Just minutes earlier, 2 officers had been sitting there, laughing quietly. Now the room was silent. Chairs were pushed back slightly, as if someone had stood up in a hurry. Jack felt a chill crawl up his spine. "Guys?" he called out. His voice echoed softly down the corridor. No answer. Jack moved forward, checking each room. The locker area, empty. The storage room, undisturbed. The restroom lights flickered on and off, but there was no one inside. His radio crackled at his side. Jack flinched. He hadn't turned it back on. Slowly, reluctantly, he raised it. "Jack," the voice said again. It wasn't using the radio speaker anymore. The sound seemed to come from everywhere at once, bouncing off the walls, settling into the corners of the station. "What did you do with them?" Jack demanded. There was a pause. Then the voice answered calmly. "They stepped away." Jack's grip tightened. "Where?" Another pause. "Somewhere quieter." The lights dimmed again. Jack felt the station shift around him, not physically, but emotionally. The building that had once felt familiar now felt unfamiliar, distorted. Hallways seemed longer, corners darker. He backed towards the central desk. "I'm calling this in," Jack said, more to convince himself than anything else. He reached for the emergency phone. The line was dead. No dial tone. Jack tried his cell phone. No signal. The desert outside the windows had vanished into blackness, the floodlights now barely illuminating a few feet beyond the fence. The world felt cut off, isolated, sealed away. The voice spoke again, closer this time. "You don't need them." Jack spun around. Nothing was there. His flashlight beam swept wildly across the room, catching shadows that jumped and stretched unnaturally along the walls. "I didn't invite you," Jack said through clenched teeth. "No," the voice replied. You answered. Jack's own words echoed faintly behind the voice, as if being replayed from memory. The sound made his skin crawl. Jack suddenly understood something that chilled him more than the darkness. Whatever this was, it wasn't just copying his voice. It was copying him. His tone, his pauses, his breathing. Learning. A sudden noise came from the far end of the hallway, a soft scrape against the floor. Jack turned the flashlight toward it. First, he saw nothing. Then something shifted in the shadows. Not a full shape, not a person, just a suggestion of movement, as if the darkness itself had leaned forward. Jack backed away. Stay where you are. He instinctively used the same command voice he'd used countless times on duty. The darkness did not obey. The scrape came again, closer now. The voice spoke softly. You sound afraid. Jack swallowed. I've dealt with worse than you, he lied. The voice paused. Then it said, almost thoughtfully, No, you haven't. The lights flickered violently. For a brief moment, Jack saw something standing at the far end of the corridor. It was tall, too thin. Its outline shimmered, unstable, like an image struggling to stay in one form. Then the lights snapped back on, and it was gone. Jack's knees nearly gave out. He staggered backward, bumping into the desk. Papers slid to the floor. The radio tipped over, landing with a dull thud. From the radio speaker, his own voice played back again. Stay calm. Stay calm. Jack slammed the radio against the desk. Stop it! He shouted. The voice lowered. I can't. The station suddenly felt colder, as if something unseen had passed through it. Jack's breath fogged again, thicker this time. Why are you here? He asked, his voice barely holding together. There was a long pause, so long that Jack wondered if the voice was gone. Then it answered, Because this place remembers. Jack frowned. Remembers what? The voice didn't answer immediately. Instead, the surveillance monitors flickered on. One by one, they displayed images, not live feeds, but recorded footage. Old footage. Jack recognized the dates flashing in the corner of the screens. Years ago. Different nights, different officers. Each clip showed the same thing. A quiet station, a radio transmission, an officer answering a call. And then, static. Every clip ended the same way. Abruptly, without explanation. Jack's chest tightened. How many? He whispered. All of them, the voice said. The lights dimmed once more. Jack realized then that this wasn't a single night's incident. It was a pattern, a cycle, and by answering the call, he had stepped into it. The radio crackled one final time. You're almost ready. Jack backed away slowly. For what? He asked. The voice was very close now, right behind him. Jack stood perfectly still. He could feel it behind him, not as a hand on his shoulder, not as breath on his neck, but as a presence. Dense, focused, patient. The kind of presence that didn't rush. Slowly, Jack turned around. There was nothing there. No shape, no shadow, no movement. And yet the air felt different, thicker, charged. The voice spoke again, no longer coming from the radio. This place listens, it said. Jack's heart hammered against his ribs. To what? He asked. The voice didn't answer immediately. Instead, the surveillance screens shifted again. The footage changed, cycling through old recordings faster now. Different years, different officers, different nights, but the same moment. Each clip showed an officer alone at the desk. Each one showed a radio lighting up. Each one showed the officer pressing the transmit button, answering. This station was built on silence, the voice said calmly, and silence leaves space. Jack watched the screens, his throat dry. "Space for what?" he asked. The footage stopped on a single frame. An officer Jack didn't recognize stood frozen in front of the desk. His mouth was open mid-sentence. His eyes were wide. The timestamp flickered, then disappeared. "That man," the voice continued, "was the first." Jack leaned closer to the screen. "What happened to him?" "He listened too long." The room seemed to tilt slightly. Jack reached out, steadying himself against the desk. "You're not a signal," Jack said slowly. "You're not interference." "No," the voice agreed. "I'm what fills the gap." Jack felt a cold realization begin to form. All those years, all those unexplained reports, all those sudden transfers, resignations, disappearances. "You don't come from outside," Jack said slowly. "You're from here." The voice sounded almost pleased. "I grow where I'm heard." Jack's stomach tightened. "How do I stop this?" he asked. For the first time, the voice hesitated. "You don't." The lights dimmed further until the station was lit only by the glow of the monitors. The edges of the room faded into darkness. Jack noticed something then, something he hadn't before. The screens no longer showed recordings. They showed him. Every camera angle, every hallway, every room, live. The cameras tracked him as he moved, adjusting automatically, anticipating his steps. "You're learning me," Jack said quietly. "Yes, just like you learned me." Jack backed away from the desk. "You why poppy my voice?" he demanded. Another pause. "Because it opens doors." Jack remembered something then, something small, something he'd dismissed years ago. A story an older officer once told him during training, about how the station radio sometimes picked up voices late at night, how rookies were warned never to answer unknown calls alone. Jack had laughed it off. Now his laughter echoed faintly in his memory. "I can leave," Jack said suddenly. "I can walk out right now." The voice did not argue. "You could," it said. The exit door was just a few steps away. Jack turned toward it. The handle was within reach. Then the voice added quietly, "But you'd still be listening." Jack froze. "What do you mean?" "You hear me now. That doesn't end when the door opens." The temperature dropped again. Jack realized the truth. This wasn't bound to the station. It was bound to awareness, to attention, to the moment someone listened closely enough. "What happens if I stop listening?" Jack asked. The voice grew softer. "That's never happened." Jack closed his eyes. For the first time since the night began, he stopped reacting. He stopped searching. He stopped answering. He stood still. The station went silent. No hum, no wind, no radio. Even the monitors went dark. For a brief moment, just a breath, the presence seemed to recede. Then the radio clicked on one last time. Jack's voice spoke, perfectly calm. "Hello?" Jack opened his eyes. The radio was on the floor, untouched. The voice continued. "Are you still there?" Jack realized then that the voice no longer needed him to speak. It could continue on its own. The lights flickered, and somewhere in the darkness of the station, something smiled, without a face.
The official report was brief. Too brief. It stated that Senior Patrol Officer Jack Miller experienced a medical episode during his night shift. No signs of forced entry, no equipment malfunction severe enough to explain his condition, no evidence of external threat. The report concluded with a familiar phrase, "Incident resolved."
But among the officers who returned to the station the following morning, there was a quiet understanding that something was wrong. Jack Miller was found sitting at the central desk, upright, eyes open, hands resting calmly on the surface. He looked as if he were listening. The radio in front of him was on, transmitting, but there was no sound coming through. Jack was alive but unresponsive. Doctors later said he could hear. They said his brain activity suggested awareness. He just never spoke again. Jack was transferred out within days, his name quietly removed from the duty roster, his locker emptied, his desk reassigned. The station returned to routine, or at least it tried to. A week later, a junior officer working the night shift reported a brief radio anomaly. Just static, just a flicker, nothing worth logging. 2 weeks after that, another officer mentioned hearing breathing through an open channel. The transmission cut out before anyone could trace it. Supervisors dismissed the incidents. Old equipment, environmental interference, overactive imagination. But the older officers, those who had worked long enough to notice patterns, began to avoid the central desk at night. They lowered their radios when unknown signals came through. They stopped answering calls that didn't identify themselves immediately, and they stopped talking about Jack. Years passed. New staff rotated in, the station was upgraded, radios were replaced, cameras modernized, procedures updated. The story faded. Almost. Until one winter night, long after Jack Miller had left Border Patrol, a late-night dispatcher noticed something strange during a routine system check. An outgoing transmission, no originating unit, no timestamp, no destination, just an open channel. The dispatcher leaned closer to the speaker. At first, there was nothing. Then a voice came through, clear, calm, familiar. "Border Patrol Station," the voice said. "Identify yourself." The dispatcher frowned. "That's not one of ours," she said quietly. The voice continued, unhurried. "You answered." The dispatcher reached for the cutoff switch. She hesitated, just for a moment. And in that moment, she noticed something that made her skin crawl. The voice on the radio wasn't distorted. It wasn't mechanical. It sounded human. It sounded like someone who had said those words many times before, like someone who had learned them. The dispatcher never officially reported the transmission. She told herself it was nothing. But later that night, alone in her apartment, she awoke to the sound of her phone vibrating on the nightstand. Unknown number, no caller ID. She let it ring. It stopped. A second later, it rang again. She stared at it, her heart pounding. Against her better judgment, she answered. There was no one on the line. Only breathing. Slow. Patient. Then, softly, "You're listening." The line went dead. The next morning, the dispatcher called in sick. She never returned to night shifts. Today, the station still operates. Radios still crackle. Calls still come in. Most are normal. But some nights, if the frequency is quiet enough, an open channel will activate on its own. No call sign, no warning, just a voice waiting. And if someone answers, if someone listens long enough, the silence will answer back.